This is Antigua Breaking News.
Prime Minister's questions.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to this Honorable House. Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House whether he or his cabinet met with the principals of Antigua Airways since the suspension of flights?
Mr. Speaker, I have held discussions with the principals of Antigua Airways as recent as a week ago.
Recognize the member for Barbuda.
This is
Mr. Speaker,
Breaking News.
can the Honourable Prime Minister tell this Honourable House whether or not it is true that the government has instructed the custodians of the CIP fund to pay a company called Marina and Resort Limited $28,000 per week US for managing the Alpha Nero vessel?
Mr. Speaker, as the member is fully aware, the government acquired ownership of the vessel. The vessel cannot be left unmanned, and as a consequence, we have to pay the crew, the captain, and the crew, and the monies are paid to the marina. The marina in turn will pay the captain and the crew on behalf of the state.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker,
This is Antigua
can the Honourable
Breaking
Prime
News.
Minister tell this Honourable House whether or not the said amount of US $28,000 per week will indeed cover all the expenses related to the Alpha Nero, including the provision of fuel?
Mr. Speaker, the amount will not cover fuel. The fuel will be credited from Western Israel Company. And let me make the point here, Mr. Speaker, that all expenses will be duly covered when the boat is actually sold. We have a number of buyers already, and we're
This
pretty
is
sure
Antigua
that within due
Breaking
course,
News.
within short order, the boat will be sold and those liabilities will be settled.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honourable Prime Minister tell this Honourable House exactly how much the government intends to pay on a weekly basis to cover all the expenses involving
This is Antigua Breaking News.
the Alpha Nero in Antigua and Barbuda?
Mr. Speaker, the government has undertaken to cover the salaries and wages, the other expenses to include the marina fees, the petroleum products that will be supplied. Those will be carried by other creditors. And as I said before, when the boat will have been sold, all of those liabilities will be retired in full, and the remaining funds will be paid into the consolidated fund.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honourable Prime Minister tell this Honourable House whether the choosing of Marina and Resort Management Limited
This is
to
Antigua
maintain the
Breaking
yacht
News.
was a result of competitive bidding?
Mr. Speaker, as a marina owner, in fact, I believe that the entire country is fully aware that the dock has been getting services from that particular marina for the last year. That is where it is. We did not choose to put it there. So I don't know how the issue of competitive bidding comes into play. Mr. Speaker, I don't wish to say anything further on that issue.
This is Antigua Breaking News.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honourable Prime Minister tell this Honourable House whether or not the government has gotten any indication as to how long the United States government might take before the actual sanctions are lifted?
This is Antigua Breaking News.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated earlier, the sanctions will be lifted in due course, and we're pretty sure that it will be done in short order. As a consequence, we'll be in a position to retire all of the liabilities and to pay the balance of the proceeds into the consolidated fund. So there'll be no net loss to the government and people of Antigua and Barbuda.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker,
This
can
is
the Honourable
Antigua
Prime
Breaking
Minister
News.
tell this Honourable House if the job to maintain the Alpha Nero went through the tenders board?
So, Speaker, that's a non-question.
Mr. Speaker, the member didn't answer the question. However,
This is Antigua
move on to the
Breaking
next
News.
question, Mr. Speaker. Can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House what portion of shares Antigua and Barbuda own in Antigua Airways?
Mr. Speaker, we had an aspiration to acquire 20% of the shares of Antigua Airways. Those shares were never executed. The agreement in which they would have utilized the CIP program in order to list it as a CIP initiative
This
did
is
not
Antigua
occur.
Breaking
And as a
News.
consequence, I would say to date that no shares has been granted, no monies have been expended.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House if the government, if the U.S.
This is
government
Antigua Breaking News.
wrote to them indicating that it wishes not to have any official or sensitive national security communication through the Honorable Stedroy Cutie Benjamin?
Mr. Speaker, I think, first of all, you know,
This is
the
Antigua Breaking
member
News.
for St. and St. Luke must learn to speak with some clarity, because the question is so confusing that I don't know precisely what you
Do
said.
your best and answer.
But if indeed you are asking that if there is some national security issue that was raised involving the Honorable Attorney General, then evidently an issue of national security is not a matter for public consumption.
This is
Therefore,
Antigua Breaking
there is
News.
no further discussion that I can have on any issue
This
involving
is Antigua
any issue of
Breaking
national
News.
security between the government of Antigua and Barbuda and that of the United States.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House whether or not the government was aware that the sanctions had to be lifted prior to
This
the
is
sale of
Antigua
the Alpha?
Breaking News.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's a process in which you have to acquire in order to take the ownership of the vessel from the sanctioned individual in order to get it delisted. That is a process that is unavoidable. It's a process that has to be followed in order to sell that property. In fact, that vessel. In fact,
This
the
is
buyer too
Antigua Breaking
has to
News.
also get a license. It's a process that we're following, and we believe that this matter will be resolved in short order, because the United States officials in the Treasury Department, they're working closely with our administration and they understand the urgency.
Mr. Speaker, can the
This
Honorable
is
Prime
Antigua
Minister tell this
Breaking
Honorable
News.
House what is the for sale value of Alfa Nero?
So, Speaker, I've seen a couple of valuations, and I believe that the for sale value ranges between 48 million US to 60 million US.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable
This
House
is Antigua Breaking News.
who is the actioneer earmarked to auction Alfa Nero?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the member for East and St. Luke is an auctioneer. But if that is the case, he may want to put in a bid in order to become the auctioneer. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Speaker, the law allows for the vessel to be sold also by private treaty. So it is not necessarily a case in which an auctioneer will be employed. There's also a process of determining the suitability of
This
the
is
bidders.
Antigua Breaking
That
News.
is also a process in which we're collaborating with our various international partners to ensure that this vessel does not end up in the hands of an oligarch or maybe some other sanctioned person. So again, it could be done by private treaty as a result of the various bids that have been sent to the port manager.
Mr. Speaker, could the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House which law firm is handling the transfer of documents of Alfa Nero?
Mr. Speaker, unlike the members of the opposition, who when they were in government would have channeled such an initiative through a law firm perhaps associated with UPP, in this particular case, this matter has been handled by the Ministry of Legal Affairs.
This is Antigua.
My final
Breaking
question,
News.
Mr. Speaker. Can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House what was the reason for the suspension of flights of Antigua Airways?
Mr. Speaker, sometime in early January, we were advised that apparently a few of the individuals who transit Antigua via
This
a
is
particular
Antigua
airline by the
Breaking
name of
News.
High Fly, that they had ended up on the shores of the U.S. southern border, or let's say on the U.S. southern border, I should say rather, seeking to enter the United States. That information was communicated to us by Impacts, and having gotten that information, and we recognize that apparently these individuals may have had intention of maybe smuggling the United States.
This is Antigua
We decided
Breaking
to
News.
close down the, and of course there was all the political noise at the time too during the election. You'd recognize that the 3 charters that came subsequently to the one on November 1st, they came in quick succession within a matter of a week, which means that we didn't have a lot of time to determine that these individuals would not have all stayed here for 1 week and then returned to Nigeria.
This is
We then
Antigua
recognized
Breaking
that
News.
you know, there was some movement in which they were seeking to probably get to the U.S. border, to U.S. territories. And on that basis, and based on all of the political noise at the time, we took the conservative position to discontinue the charters.
Mr. Speaker, I know I said I had a final question, but just a follow-up. But Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable
This
Prime
is
Minister tell this
Antigua
Honorable
Breaking
House
News.
if his government received a letter from ECA sometime in December in regards to the suspension of flights from Antigua Airways?
So, Speaker, not to my knowledge.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime
This
Minister tell
is
this Honorable
Antigua
House
Breaking News.
what exactly is the status of Antigua Airways? Does it exist? What's going on with it?
Mr. Speaker, Antigua Airways, as you know, has had difficulties as a result of one of their charters that was utilized to bring individuals here who obviously had aspirations to get on to the United States, and the suspension of the charter.
This is
I would
Antigua
say that
Breaking News.
the company is not trading at this time. However, having spoken to the principals, they have indicated that they are interested in acquiring a couple of planes and sometime in the future to pursue this initiative of establishing the air bridge between Nigeria and Antigua and Barbuda. I will say here that it is still an aspiration for my government to pursue that air bridge.
This is
And
Antigua
we're even
Breaking
speaking with
News.
other entities. We're also speaking with other African investors. So we have not given up on that noble initiative of establishing an air bridge between Africa and the Caribbean. So we'll have further discussions as to what systems we can put in place to avoid what would have happened in December of last year.
This is
And we do
Antigua
recognize too
Breaking
that
News.
you know, we'll have to perhaps have some discriminatory policies in place, in the sense that countries in Africa where there's any form of instability, we may just have to have a ban on granting any form of access to a country. So rather than issuing a visa or any visa waivers, we may just have to preclude
This is Antigua Breaking
citizens of
News.
those countries to avoid any repeat of such situation. Now, what seemed to have happened in the case of those who came here, apparently most of them, over 90%, and as you know, the IOM and the UNHCR would have done an investigation and would have come to the conclusion, based on the interviews, that over 90% of them were actually running from instability in Cameroon. But it would appear that over 50% of them had already left the Cameroon and were in Nigeria. So having established that flight between Nigeria and Antigua and Barbuda, it was quite, let's say, opportunistic for them to capitalize on that flight and to come to Antigua and Barbuda ostensibly as tourists, because that is what they stated, obviously with the aspiration of maybe transiting Antigua and to eventually get to the United States. So again, I just want to reiterate that we have not given up on that noble ambition to ensure that there's connectivity between Africa and the Caribbean. but we recognize that you know, we have to put additional systems in place to avoid any such, let's say, opportunistic migratory pattern that we saw developing during the last few flights in December of last year.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House how many VIP passports were granted to the principals of Antigua Airways?
The answer is 0. And I believe that I would have stated that, you know, no funds were invested and no citizenships have been granted, no shares were issued.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, given what has taken place over the past few months with Antigua Airways, to include some of these Cameroonians, or let me rephrase myself, to include the loss of life by persons who attempted to leave Antigua and Barbuda illegally, and other questionable processes that was identified. Why is the government opposed to call a public inquiry into this matter?
So, Speaker, practically all of the information is in the public domain, and even today would have shared additional information. This idea that there may have been, let's say, some smoking gun or some form of what evidence you call it, not conclusive, but circumstantial evidence of any form of wrongdoing by any member of the administration to warrant an investigation, or what you call it, a public inquiry. There's none. The reality is we established this air bridge between Nigeria and Antigua and Barbuda, and there are some who capitalize on accessing our country, obviously with intent to migrate to the United States. None of us had any information to that effect. It could have happened to any other country. In fact, I'm told too that the same high-fly airline got on to another Caribbean country and had sought to take a charter there. And they indicated to them that they were bringing African tourists. But already, the situation with Antigua is already in the public domain. So they were able to advise their officials not to proceed based on what had happened here. So it could have happened to any other country. So there's no need. I mean, if you are able to provide any information, a scintilla of information to suggest that there was any collusion for human trafficking or, let's say, migrant smuggling, then fine. But you have not come up with any evidence. Now let me give you another example. A few years ago, a former candidate of the UPP was accused of being involved in human trafficking. He was actually operating a brothel. And we ensured that there was due process. And when we did our preliminary investigations, we recognized that there was no such thing. But even the United States government had approached my administration to investigate the matter. In fact, there were 2 individuals. One of them ended up in court and was eventually acquitted. So the point I'm saying here, there must be at least some circumstantial evidence. It's not what you think, what you believe, and what you're trying to peddle in the society for political gain that will support or justify the need for an expensive public inquiry. The reality is, we have been very open. We brought in the IOM, we brought in the UNHCR, and not one of them, over 100 of them were interviewed, not one of them said that they were part of any human trafficking ring or any smuggling ring. So if they're not going to say so then, and you have a public inquiry, they're going to say so then, you are literally defeating your own argument. But you know what? We're not in any argument with you. At the end of the day, it's our call. We have taken a decision. There'll be no public inquiry. So you can talk from now to thy kingdom come. There'll be none.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House who authorized the landing of these passengers without the visa required from leaving Nigeria?
Mr. Speaker, all of the passengers were duly landed by officials within the Immigration Department, and they satisfied all the requirements. They were landed legally in this country. None of them were smuggled into the country.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House whether or not the visas were granted on arrival or before they got to Antigua?
Mr. Speaker, visas were granted to these individuals. They were interviewed by immigration officials. They satisfied at the time that they had sufficient monies to assist with the upkeep while vacationing. And that is the information that is available.
Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Prime Minister tell this Honorable House whether or not these passengers came on a one-way ticket or they have a return ticket?
Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge, those who had decided to return directly to Nigeria, they had their return tickets, and there were some who were transiting Antigua, Mr. Speaker. So they would have had their onward tickets to other destinations. What would have happened? After it was recognized that a number of them were trying to get into the United States, a number of Caribbean countries actually closed their borders to them. Suriname apparently was one of the transit points, and Suriname closed its borders. So these individuals, Mr. Speaker, who are not only Africans, I'm told too that we have some Indians as well, they were trying to leave the country to go to different destinations. But because of the situation which we recognize that we were trying to migrate or maybe smuggle into the United States, most Caribbean countries actually close their borders to them. I met one of them up to recently, Mr. Speaker, last Saturday at Epicurean. And the person said to me, he's a businessman. He has a business in Africa, an ongoing business. He came here on a vacation. He says the situation is not similar to that of the Cameroonians. However, the problem that he's faced with now is that he cannot get out of Antigua because the assumption by most of the, let's say, regional governments in which he will have to transit is that he's involved in some form of migrant smuggling. So as a consequence, I've asked him to come and see me tomorrow, he and others who he said are involved in that situation, for us to get Foreign Affairs to intervene and to try and assist to get them out, because there's no direct flight between Antigua and Barbuda and Nigeria. So we will now have to make an intervention at the level of Foreign Affairs to try and facilitate them. But again, Mr. Speaker, they either had a return ticket or they had a ticket to take them to another destination somewhere within the region.
Member for Barbuda.
Mr. Speaker, public interest. Is there any truth, Honorable Prime Minister, that when some of these African brothers and sisters were landed, that the immigration is saying that there was a mix-up with the flight number, thinking that it was Antigua Airways, and the flight ended up not to be Antigua Airways?
Mr. Speaker, there is some evidence to confirm that the high-fly flight was actually listed as an Antigua Airways flight when it was not. And I can't speak to precisely what happened as to why there was that mix-up. But that is indeed correct, Mr. Speaker, that the assumption by those who accommodated the flight at the time, and remember that flight came in at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, there was an assumption that it was Antigua Airways, but it was not. And again, you know, because it was a charter too, I mean, the charters do not have the type of, let's say, sharing of documentation. You have what is called the APIS, the Advanced Passenger Information System. Apparently there's some relaxation in terms of sharing information before as well. So those are some of the things that we would have learned from. And again, it would appear that the officials assumed that high fly coming out of Nigeria and Antigua Airways were the same. In fact, no member of the cabinet here had any inclination whatsoever that there was another airline that was actually given entry. So the assumption by practically all of us, everybody in the country, was that all of them came through via Antigua Airways, which was not the case.
Mr. Speaker, given all this, taking time to deal with this, isn't the government obligated, Mr. Speaker, to at least have an independent investigation into this matter, given what the Prime Minister said?
I believe that you asked that question
I'm
already.
asking the question to the Prime
No, you asked that
Yes,
question
that's-
already and was answered already, so.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, to the Honorable Prime Minister, isn't the government obligated at least to have
Member
an
for Barbuda,
independent-
you asked that question before, and
I
it
asked
was,
for inquiry, I'm now asking for independent investigation. The
say,
difference, Mr. Speaker, there's a Public Inquiry Act,
yes,
right?
yes.
That certain things has to be followed. An independent investigation can take many forms. It's different from a public inquiry.
Oh, I see. So
Right.
you want an independent.
That's what I'm asking the Honorable Member.
Go right ahead, sir.
Mr. Speaker, we have a group of public servants comprising a committee. We had appointed Darren Joseph to head that committee and other public officials, and a significant amount of research work was done to determine what the situation is. We are not going to pander to the requirements of the opposition. You guys looking for comments, it's not going to happen. At the end of the day, we have shared all information with you publicly. When the airline was established, we went to the public, we told the public precisely what we're doing, that we're establishing an air bridge between Nigeria and Antigua and Barbuda. And unfortunately, these individuals, you know, came initially as tourists, decided that they do not wish to go back home. We stuck with them. We have assimilated them into the society, even though 80-something% of them said that they have experienced some level of discrimination, obviously fueled by members on the other side. We have decided to treat them in a dignified manner as human beings. The majority of them are actually tertiary trained, either college or university. Many of them come with a significant amount of skills. And we believe that ultimately these individuals will be assets to this country, and we are not involved in this mess that is being promoted by members of the other side who are seeking to promote a political agenda and obviously to continue to discriminate against these individuals who were literally running, Mr. Speaker, from political instability in their home country. And I want to remind those on the other side too that as a government we have an obligation to treat these people in a dignified manner. They have rights as well too, you know. They're not dogs, they're human beings. And I want to tell you, many of them are better educated than practically all of you all over there.
Prime Minister,
Ain't going any further.
remember for Barbuda, the 30 minutes for Prime Minister's question has expired. Thank you. You used to get a bye before, but you see there are other people present, other members. Right? So, I have one question. How is the temperature down there?